As many of you, I hope know, we're here with Jonah Goldberg. Jonah is the editor-in-chief and co-founder of The Dispatch, a Los Angeles Times columnist, Fox News contributor, author of 3 New York Times bestsellers. I think that's your bio.
That's right.
So great. So we're talking a bit today about, conservatism and media. Now, I'm sure most of our attendees here pay attention to the news, and with the coronavirus and the civil unrest that's happening in the country right now, it's put a lot of stress and pressure on newsrooms across the country and in the mainstream media, and we're seeing a lot of that results right now in kind of editors getting fired and people getting canceled, and kind of stuff seems to be happening very fast, and news stories and news judgment seems to be changing at the same pace too. So I guess our conversation, I want to start a little bit with how did we get here? And framing that question with, we had kind of a partisan media where every town had a, quarried-in Republican, quarried-in Democrat, and they would kind of, write for their prospective parties. Then in the post-war era, we kind of got this idea of an unbiased media that strived to be objective, the Walter Cronkite, and that's how it is. So I guess my first question is, in kind of that, version of media history, was the objective, unbiased media ever real, or was it just a veneer we had because of the way like technology and network news and large newspapers shaped the media environment?
Yeah, I can tell you listened to my rant on my podcast from last week, where I talked about some of this stuff. I probably shouldn't have left it in the locker room and saved it for here. I apologize. Look, there are two ways to approach the question of objectivity, right? One is the sort of postmodern / epistemological thing. Can you ever get outside of your biases? Are you all that kind of stuff? And then there's just the which we can just put to one side, and then there's just the issue of just straight old-fashioned journalism. And I think that objectivity was always sort of fool's gold. It was always kind of a myth. You could argue it was an ideal, and there's some defense of trying to do that. If reporters kept asking themselves, am I being objective when I put it this way, that would probably be helpful. Judges go through an enormous amount of legal training, and have all sorts of elaborate rules of ethics and conduct to seem impartial and objective. And it's clear that judges can't do that perfectly either, but it's a good ideal to have. But the simple fact is, look, there was never any such thing in the history of journalism up until fairly recently of this notion of just pure objectivity. If you go back and you read the newspapers that covered the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it's awesome. The pro-Douglas newspapers, are writing about how Lincoln was reduced to a quivering mass of goo as Douglas unleashed the full fury of his intellect on him. And then, the pro-Lincoln papers were like, Douglas had to be restrained by 5 men. He was so incensed by being humiliated by Lincoln. And, maybe if you read both accounts, you could get some sort of sense of what was going on. But, the history of newspapers in the 19th century was that they were very partisan. Doesn't mean they were all bad. Doesn't mean they all lied. And you can see sort of a vestigial echo of what newspapers were kind of like in the United States by just looking at Europe. Look at England, right? England, you have the Telegraph. I think it's a great paper. You know where it's coming from. It's kind of like, conservative. The Times, at least it used to be kind of Tory. The Guardian is Bolshevik or Maoist or whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't mean they're bad newspapers. It just means you know where they're coming from. You know why they're covering certain stories, why they think certain questions are more important than other questions, and all these kinds of things. And I think that actually helps the news consumer. what happened in America was in part because of the telegraph, but then really radio, and then incredibly so because of television and American faith in technology. There was this idea that all you needed to do was put a microphone on something or put a camera on something, and you can just impart the facts unmediated by the interpretation of the reporter. And it turns out that TV doesn't work like that. The TV can be distorting. Just look at look what they did with video of the Covington high school kids at that march in Washington. You nearly got people wanting to go on mass shooting sprees because of that thing. And it was all distorted. And so I personally think that the key, and this is where it gets to a larger conservative point. I know we don't want to get too deep into conservative ideology stuff here, but one of the things I've always loved about conservatism, at least for most of my life, is that conservatives acknowledge their biases.
Right.
We acknowledge our dogma. We say, yeah, there's a trade-off between liberty and virtue, freedom and order. And we try to find where those lines are and adjust them to reality. And we constantly, I'm a geek, no offense, you're a geek. We live in these circles where, in Washington, most of my friends were these kinds of people who would argue about what political philosophers they wanted on their ties. And they talk like Dungeons and Dragons dorks. I'm a level 9 Hayekian, and that kind of thing. And I love that stuff about conservatism. And I think that's a useful frame to apply to journalism, and that the best journalism out there to some extent is opinion journalism, reported opinion journalism, I would say, but where where the author is coming from. He's bringing new facts, or she's bringing new facts, and she's making an argument. And you can tell how honest somebody is, whether it's in the pages of the New Yorker or the New Republic or a National Review or the Dispatch, by how accurately and fairly they describe the other side's argument. It's like a Turing test. And you're dealing with some sort of a cheap hack when they ascribe to the people they disagree with the most cartoonishly villainous motivations for everything.
Right.
But when they say, the other side actually makes a good point here, and this is what we're grappling with and all that kind of stuff, that's a way you actually can get to truth and bring your readers along with it. The problem with a lot of the stuff that passes for objective journalism in the mainstream media is that they're blind to their own biases. And that's been a problem with progressivism going back to, the progressive era and pragmatism, and before that, Comtean positivism and all this kind of stuff, where they assume that science and reason are synonymous with their position. Right. And therefore, anybody who disagrees with their position must be ill-motivated or crazy or bigoted in some way. And I think that same sort of presumption informs a lot of the supposedly objective media, where they're just bringing their biases to bear, but because they're not used to doing a rigorous personal inventory about what their biases are, they just take it for granted as the truth.
Now, to push back a little bit, do you think that the kind of fact that conservatives are open about their bias have created and kind of sectioned off a conservative media apart from the mainstream media? Like, is there a downside to kind of how that's operated in just like the post-war conservative movement era?
Well, to a certain extent, but I think that has it has less to do with us owning our biases. Although that's, I think that does give us a little bit of a handicap. And I'm not saying that you can't be a conservative and work at the New York Times and do that kind of reporting in that mode and still be good at it. There are some secret sub rosa conservatives, in the mainstream media who do good work. And they do because they know the shibboleths that they're supposed to speak in the newsroom and all that kind of stuff. But I would say the ghettoization of conservatism, which is a real issue, which is sort of what you're pointing at, and it's something I've been writing against for a very long time. There are a lot of other reasons for it. I think conservatism was not well served by the fact that, since we're talking about the media, that it didn't put a lot of emphasis into reporting, that it didn't put a lot of emphasis into even sort of the muckraking kind of stuff, including against its own side. Truth squatting your own side, which is part of the ideological and intellectual mission of National Review for a long time, is an incredibly important point, because if you're not willing to sort of, it's like when you're playing, stickball as a kid, you earn credibility when every now and then you say, yeah, my guy was out. And if you don't say, yeah, my guy is out, you just seem like you're pure team. But part of the downstream effect of that is that conservatism got into this very comfortable rut of basically just commenting on the news that was being produced by other people. And I noticed this when I founded National Review Online. Turns out news gathering is really expensive. Opinions are really cheap. And so whatever you think of Rush Limbaugh now, what you thought about him 20 years ago, all that kind of stuff, he was really good in his heyday at taking stuff from the mainstream media and criticizing it. We were conservatism built itself up as an opposition party, sort of Radio Free America kind of thing, a lot of the talk radio, AM radio, all that kind of stuff. But what we were doing for the most part was living off of the conversation pieces provided by the mainstream media rather than providing our own and doing our own reporting. And that's been corrected a little bit. It's part of what we're trying to do long term at the Dispatch. Fox News on the news side still does real reporting and doesn't get the kind of credit it deserves, in part because it just gets outshined by the opinion side. Right. But a lot of conservatives just like being in the ghetto. They're like, I don't want to play with those people. We want our own institutions. We want our own stuff. It's one of the reasons why William F. Buckley helped found ISI, was because we needed our own institutions. But part of ISI's mission is actually to take back some of these institutions, or at least have a hold in them, right? Look, I have my arguments with Hillsdale these days, but Hillsdale's a wonderful college. I taught there. We would be much better off as a country if we had a lot more conservatives on the faculty at Harvard than if we had 10 more Hillsdales, because our culture needs these institutions. You can't create new old institutions. Harvard has a brand name that you're not going to be able to recreate in a century. And the country would be much better off if our elites were exposed to, at a young age, thoughtful conservative arguments early on at those institutions, rather than just having them caricatured by sort of woke mob type ringleaders.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's certainly what ISI is about, and what the Collegiate Network's about it with the media. And so I guess my next question kind of has to do with like the target of conservative media and the kind of impact that it has. So there's kind of the elite opinion shaping that magazines like National Review, the Weekly Standard have historically done, and then kind of the conservatism for the masses, call it Fox News or Rush, or even Firing Line, right? And what which do you think is more important? And do you think conservatives have invested too much on one side or the other?
Yeah. So my standard answer to this 5 years ago, when people ask me, to defend or denounce Glenn Beck or Ann Coulter or Rush Limbaugh or me or whoever, is conservatism is kind of like a symphony. And in every symphony, you need the fine woodwinds, which do like what National Affairs does, what the best stuff of the National Review does, what commentary does, serious highbrow arguments, peer-to-peer among elites, and also to those sort of from the Jeffersonian elite, who are self-motivated to go to school on this stuff. You need that stuff, fine points, nuanced points, all of that kind of thing. But you also need that dude with the hammer and the big gong, right? And that's when you have a full symphony, you have the right balance of those things. That was my answer for a long time. And I still basically stand by that. The problem is that the symphony is like all gong these days. And it's very hard to hear the woodwinds when the gong is going off constantly, or the giant percussion things. And that is in part because, this is something conservatives really don't like to hear these days, because there's this riot of victimology that runs through conservatism these days. But a lot of conservatism problems, particularly in the media, are problems of their success, not of their failure. If you had told Bill Buckley, 30 years ago, that Fox News would be a right of center news organization that would dominate every slot of the day, every hourly slot of the day, every day, every year for like 20 years, right? You would thought you're crazy, and you can go through all of these kinds of things where there is conservatism. People like to give me grief for saying I'm part of Conservatism Inc., but I'm sort of conservatism nonprofit compared to Real Conservatism Inc., which is the stuff that, gets huge ad rates, that fills auditoriums, all of that kind of stuff. And so the problem that we've gotten is that, particularly for a lot of people sort of a little younger than me, you can have a perfectly fine career only talking to audiences that already agree with you. And this was a problem for conservatism before the balkanization of the media occurred, because now it's a problem for everybody. The New York Times basically is telling its audiences what it wants to hear. MSNBC is owned by its audience. Fox, to a large extent, is owned by its audience. And I think it's trying to break free of that. But on the opinion side, it surely is. Talk radio, to a large extent. When the audience moved into a pro-Trump direction, most of talk radio went with it. They didn't start that way. And those who didn't go with it are like Mike Medved and Charlie Sykes and a few others who just lost their jobs. And so there is this problem, and it's an acute problem for conservatism, and it's one I care about more because I care about more about conservatism than I do about the media. But across the spectrum, we're seeing the result of this breakdown of big institutions being news organizations are more concerned with telling their audiences what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And that has real knock-on effect problems for conservatism in particular, because conservatism does not control the commanding heights of the culture. And so when rank and file conservatives get in a real cranky mood and want to hear about how they're all victims and being picked on, that's what they're told. And then it becomes reinforcing. Right.
Now, to get on the New York Times a little bit, so for our viewers that may not be on Twitter all the time, the New York Times published an op-ed by Tom Cotton, kind of the news side of the New York Times seemed to be kind of the loudest voice in opposition to it, and kind of their opposition eventually got the opinion editor, James Bennett of the New York Times, fired. And
out, right? I mean, he says he resigned, but that's probably because he
fired,
resigned.
Right. And in that context, it's for sure kind of a mob.
I think it's fair. Yeah.
So I have. I guess my first question is this just noise, or does this change anything as far as like how we see the New York Times as an institution, or is it really just like a clarifying moment, but the institutional kind of challenges have already been there?
Yeah, so, I think there are a lot of things going on, and I'm against monocausal explanations for anything. Things are complicated. History unfolds in weird, zigzaggy ways. But so one of the things I think is going on, and this is going on at a lot of institutions, I think it explains what happened at the Atlantic with my friend Kevin Williamson. I think it explains some of the crazy stuff that is coming out of NBC News on a fairly regular basis, is that the younger, woker 20-somethings are intimidating the crap out of the Gen Xers and the younger baby boomers. And it really is sort of a revolution from below. And none of these people have the guts or the intestinal fortitude to stand up to these kids and say, I don't care that much about your feelings. I mean, I think that's a big part of a larger trend. I know a lot of people sort of my age at various mainstream media institutions who are just straight up terrified of the children of the corn who look up from the cubicles when they walk into the office. So that's part of it. I also think that part of it is this need to pander to the audience. The New York Times audience thinks that they are the smartest, most enlightened, most decent people in the universe. And they define the realm of respectable, controversial opinion to be like David Brooks really is edgy for the New York Times readership, right? Which is funny because my understanding is that David Brooks is in fact the most read columnist at the New York Times, but for the core audience that the Times caters to, he's like the wild and crazy right winger on there, and so I think that one of the things that this reveals is this ideological makeup of this younger cohort, but it also reveals how weak the institution is. Right. This is a Yuval Levin point that I've made my own a long time ago, but most of our problems as a society these days have to do with weak institutions, whether it's the family, the church, local communities, up and down, horizontal, vertical institutions have a real crisis of confidence in our society. And the New York Times is one of them. The New York Times has the same problem that the Republican Party has, that a lot of institutions have, which is they think that the majority of their people get to decide how the institution is going to run. And that's not how healthy institutions work. You do not put up any major policies in the Marine Corps up for a vote, right? You do not put up fundamental questions of theology in the Catholic Church up for a vote. In your family, you might want to get everybody's opinion, but if you've got a bunch of little kids, they don't get to outvote mom and dad, right? Institutions in a democratic society depends on a lot of undemocratic institutions to hold it all together, like trees holding the soil into the ground with their roots. And the Times, like a lot of these other places, they're weak institutions, and so the leadership just caves to the mob. And so on the merits, this was so incandescently stupid to freak out about Tom Cotton. Look, I think Tom Cotton's wrong. I think he was wrong. I'm with Bill Gates. I'm with Bob Gates. I'm with a lot of, serious, people who look at this and say, look, the National Guard is one thing, but dropping the 101st Airborne, which is trained to kill people and blow stuff up, is not a great idea. And by all means, let's nationalize, let's bring in more National Guard troops, do all that kind of stuff. I'm totally fine with that when it's called for, but using the Insurrection Act is a bad idea. But there's a perfectly reasonable argument to make, particularly at that moment where it seemed like the violence was spiraling out of control. I think the fact that it stopped spiraling out of control is part of the sign that Cotton was wrong. But they treated Cotton's op-ed the way, as I put it the other day, it was sort of like the way the French Catholic Church viewed Napoleon using their houses of worship as stables. It was this unbelievable transgression against all that is holy. And right. It just wasn't. It was, and for an op-ed page that runs stuff from, mass murdering tyrants overseas and whatnot, I can make the argument that if Cotton was calling for concentration camps for Black Lives Matter, which I'm not saying he would, I'm not saying I would endorse that, there's a pretty strong argument the Times should run that op-ed too, so that he could be denounced for it, right? I mean, this is how democracy works, with vigorous disagreement about stuff. But just, this, get me to my fainting couch, pants wetting hysteria about it really just told you a lot about the internal sociology at the New York Times and very little about the merits or demerits of Tom Cotton's position.
Right. I mean, it's a widely held position in polling too. I think 60% of the country shared some kind of view of sending in the troops.
I do want to just say that I think that number was pretty soft. I mean, it was perfectly fine for Cotton to cite it. It was like 58% said they're in favor of using the Army. My suspicion is if you explain to the respondents who said that we don't mean the National Guard, we mean, the Green Berets, that number would have dropped a bit. But still, the mere fact that people are thinking that way is a perfectly legitimate reason to run it as an op-ed.
Right. And I mean, they've certainly ran crazier op-eds than that. So I have the kind of pull quote here from Ross Southet's piece on kind of the New York Times situation. So he wrote, and because the media is more consolidated than in the past, its talent is concentrated in a few cities with a few papers, starting the landscape, and smaller outlets are fading every day. it's a mistake to see this change as just a return of partisan journalism that dominated the 19th century America. We don't suddenly have a Democratic and Republican newspaper battling in every city. Instead, we have a national media that moves as a herd. It doesn't think of itself as partisan because partisans are partial and biased. And the assumption is that in rejecting neutrality, we're just moving towards the truth. So that kind of view where, kind of the premier news making institutions in the country that have the most reporters are kind of now shifting to see complex debates as more of a, good and evil type of thing, and with a clear bad guy and a clear good guy. How do you think in the long term that's going to affect kind of the way we see institutional media, mainstream media? And do you think kind of the news judgment side of things will be more impacted than it was in the past?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. There is, I mean, one of the reasons why we started the Dispatch was because we think there's too much shouting out there and too much, sort of monetization of dopamine hits, by which I mean, like, you make people angry with very manipulative use of the facts. And then once you get their eyeballs, you really don't care if the facts pan out. I mean, how many times, how many of those like embedded ads have you ever clicked on that promise you something really interesting, and then you get there and it's not really interesting, but that you've served your purpose for them. And I think there's a lot of that going on in the media. Everyone is trying to troll for eyeballs, and I think that's a huge problem. At the same time, I'm generally optimistic about Americans and America. I'm a long run, bull on all this kind of stuff. But the real problem isn't innovation, isn't disruption. It's whether or not people have the time to process it, right? To understand it. There was a lot of disruption that came with the introduction of radio. I think in America, we went from the first radio coming off the assembly line to 50% saturation in every household in like 10 years, which is kind of wild, right? And you think about what the iPhone, which was released only a little over a decade, has done. There's an enormous amount of churn and disruption going on. In the 1930s, radio fueled populism. In the 2020s or the 20-teens, social media is fueling a different kind of populism. Eventually, if you can reach sort of a steady state, people know how to price in a lot of this kind of stuff. And I thought it was really interesting that during the early days of the pandemic, without naming names, a lot of the websites that peddle BS and nonsense, they saw their traffic plummet because there was something in the back of the head. Even the people who loved a lot of those sites was just like, I know, Elon Omar wants to put me in a camp, but I really got to find out whether my kid can go to summer camp or whether or not my business is ever going to reopen. And they wanted harder, more real news. And I think that's a good sign that in the back of their heads, a lot of people understood that what they were following as news was actually entertainment. And that's one of the big problems we have in our culture generally, is we're following politics as a form of entertainment rather than what it is, which is not a form of entertainment.
Right.
So I think it's possible we can adjust. There are a lot of innovators. I mean, I'm not the greatest entrepreneur in the history of humanity. I started this little thing with Steve Hayes. But I think we already know that there is a market for sort of more serious, less histrionic stuff. My suspicion is that we're barely tapping that market, and that there are other places that can tap into it. But it requires the thrill of the new that we've been going through for the last 10 years to kind of wear off. And so it could be a while before we can absorb all of these changes, particularly as the changes are still proceeding really fast. Right. And that makes it hard. That's why everything seems so out of balance, is it's just everything is coming at us so much faster, and it's so much more difficult to process. Eventually, I think we'll be able as a culture to catch up with it, but it's going to take time.
Now, do you think maybe that happens because of, I guess, the incongruity in innovation as far as like the world of atoms versus the world of communication, right? So like you walk into ISI headquarters right now, probably doesn't look very different than it did when it opened in 1996. Minus the big screen TV and the computers that look a lot different. But, if you go on those computers and you communicate, that's like, a whole new world that didn't exist, 25 years ago. So do you think that, if innovation in the rest of life speeded up, that the kind of obsession with the hot new social media site or what people are tweeting would kind of, go down a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of a very Douthadian, Ross. We have to figure out what we call his ideological school, but I do think that if the pace of innovation that we've had with stuff that goes on screens was going on in the real world, a lot more people would be outside rather than looking at screens, right? Like, right. Look, I mean, I play this stupid Star Trek Fleet Command game on my phone a lot, but if I had a jetpack, I'd play it a lot less, right? So I think there's some truth to that. It is funny to have a teenage daughter, and it's a little encouraging. Screens are a big part of her life, but I would argue screens were a bigger part of her life 3 years ago than they are now. I mean, they're sort of starting to figure out, this is how I talk to my friends, but there are other things going on. And, but this is a problem I have. I don't know how we're going to get jetpacks, never mind colonies on Mars. That is outside of my lane. But I do think that, Irving Kristol used to say, and it turned out he was wrong, but he used to say there was nothing wrong with this country that a good recession wouldn't fix. And it turns out he was wrong, because in 2008 we had a recession and it didn't fix everything. But and we're having another one now, and doesn't seem to be fixing everything. But I will point out that after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, there was a huge spike immediately afterwards of people having facial and neck tattoos removed.
Right.
And I mean that kind of seriously. Is that, again, this is sort of a problem of Americans. It's not just conservative, but American Western success. This is a very new thing for humanity. It's not even like new in the sense of 300 years old. It's new in like 100 years old or 50 years old, that the average person, on an objective measure, their biggest problems are dealing with prosperity and abundance, not dealing with scarcity and survival. And that takes times for cultures to figure out. And I think we can do it, but it's going to take a little while.
So to shift topics a little bit, let's talk a little bit about your new venture. So the Dispatch, I guess my first question is, what makes it different than other kind of right-leaning media outlets? And what are your hopes for it as an institution in the long term?
Sure. I mean, look, you can, if you're going to do sort of Chinese menu and pick certain writers at certain institutions who are doing things, there are plenty of places that do what the Dispatch is doing, in the terms of the quality of the stuff that they do, that we do. What we're doing is starting from a sort of a different set of assumptions. I will never speak ill of National Review, at least while most of my friends are still there. They do fantastic stuff. I did not leave in some huff. I got my, my disagreements with some people, but there's nothing, there's no bad blood of any kind. I think Rich Lowry does a fantastic job with a fantastic magazine. That said, I think, first of all, just put the dispatch out of it for 2 seconds. One of the problems that conservatism has, which again, I care more about conservatism than I do about the media. One of the problems that conservatism has is that, and it's a problem that you have, it's a problem of success, is that when William F. Buckley set out to sort of influence the Republican Party and move it rightward, there was a lot of headbutting, right? I mean, Richard Nixon said that the Buckleyites were more dangerous than the Birchers. I mean, like, there was a real healthy tension there. And that's changed. Now, basically, conservatives are like the dog that chases the car and catches it and now doesn't know how to drive. And there's a huge problem in conservatism these days where even some of the brightest and best people I admire, people who are smarter than me, people who I seek guidance from, so I'm not denigrating them, but you can hear it when you have conversations with them or when you read some of their writing. They think their job is to basically be sort of at least a little bit, and sometimes a lot, a political consultant for the GOP. That, this is what the GOP needs to do to get elected. This is what the GOP, blah, 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 blah. And if you're a political writer, that's fine. If you're a certain kind of pundit, that's fine. If you're a political consultant, that's your frickin' job. But the problem is, at some point, it's very difficult to tell where the chocolate ends and the peanut butter begins in this. And I think that's in part because people have internalized this idea that the Republican Party is sort of the sword and conservatism is the shield. And they work in tandem in these battles. And I think that this is a problem that exists, that is particularly problematic for the conservative movement. But this is also getting back to what I was saying earlier about weakened institutions. This is a problem for the media. The New York Times is now, I mean, Trump is right. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't do good jobs in reporting certain stories and that their news pages are all garbage. I'm not saying any of that. But in a really significant sense, the New York Times is an extension of the Democratic Party. It just is. The opinion side of Fox News, and look, I keep waiting for the hammer to drop for me to get fired from Fox News, but the opinion side of Fox News is simply an extension of the Trump administration. It just is. With the exception of Tucker, who at least, I mean, I think Tucker's wrong on a lot of his philosophical positions, but at least Tucker is trying to do a sort of Buckleyite thing of moving Trump in a direction. The rest of them are largely just turd polishing on the opinion side. MSNBC is more biased than Fox News is. Fox News at least has this wall that they try to maintain, distinguishing between the news side and the opinion side. There is no wall there at MSNBC. And to a certain extent, there's not at CNN. There are a couple people who I think try pretty hard to do a fair and, an objective job. And this is in part this thing about weakening institutions. The Republican and Democratic parties are on respirators. I think it was Ross who said they're basically planes waiting on the tarmac, waiting to be hijacked. And that's how we got Trump in 2016. That's how we almost got Bernie Sanders in 2016 in the Democratic Party. We are the first industrialized major democracy in the world whose political parties have voluntarily given up the responsibility of picking their own candidates. It's all been democratized. And that's a problem. And so what happens is a lot of media fills that vacuum and starts doing party work without realizing it, which is what newspapers did in the 19th century. They did voter education. They did voter outreach. They framed issues. They did opposition research and all the rest. The problem is that they kind of took their lead from a political party that had some backbone and that cared about its long-term reputation and interest. Now they're basically just pop-up marketing brands. You win the nomination, all of a sudden the Republican Party is the Trump Party, and any sort of dissent about what it's used to believe just gets thrown out the window. And so one of the things we want to do at the Dispatch, to make this long-winded rant a little shorter, is reject all of that. I'm a conservative. I will stack up my credentials as a conservative against pretty much anybody's. I'm at this point, I'm so disgusted with the Republican Party, I just don't care. That doesn't mean like if I had my druthers, the Republicans would hold on to the Senate. Purely to stop Democrats and that kind of thing. But I am not going to go out and lie for the Republican Party. I'm not going to say something that I don't think is true to benefit Donald Trump or the Republican Party or candidates. I am not going to try to put the best light on the Republican position, because I no longer think the Republican Party is simply the reflection of what conservatism means. And I want to go back to this old Buckleyite idea of holding the Republican Party accountable rather than serving as a messaging consultant for the Republican Party. Now, Steve comes at this from Steve Hayes, my partner in all this, my business partner in all this. Steve is much more interested on the strict nuts. He's a Columbia Journalism School guy. He loves reporting. I agree with him in principle and philosophically, and it's a business plan and all that kind of stuff. It's not where my passions lie, but I think it's really important. But he wants to build up reporting that shows neither fear nor favor. You know where we're coming from. We're going to cover stories and ask questions differently than the liberal mainstream media would, because we're conservatives and we come from that position. But we are not political consultants. We are not spinners for a party. And I'm not saying that every single person at these other conservative institutions that I'm not at is doing that either. But we want to make this part of our bedrock mission in a way that other places haven't done.
Right. Well, with that, I'm going to get to the Q&A here. We have some good questions for you. Before I do that, I'll do a little pitch for ISI here. So are you tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus, eager to go back or eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom? Learn the timeless principles of liberty so that you can pursue truth and freedom. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and a community they don't find at their universities. And in this process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. So to get the college education you deserve, you can become a member today at join.isi.org, join.isi.org. I'm not as good as the ad reads as you are yet, Jonah.
I'll throw in, I wasn't asked for this. I don't think I'm getting paid for this or anything. I'm happy to do this for ISI. ISI is one of the great conservative institutions. It does really important work. It's not about pandering to whatever's fashionable. It actually cares about ideas, cares about arguments, cares about training people's minds. And so free ad for ISI. I'm happy to plug it.
I'll make sure to clip that. So, first question here from Amy Stapleton. Amy asks, what will it take to loosen the grip of Twitter on the news cycle?
That's a great question. I don't know. This is one of these things. It's sort of like alcohol. I know I would be healthier if I gave up alcohol. I know I would be healthier if I gave up Twitter. And I actually think it's sort of the same thing for the country. The world would be better if Twitter did not exist. The problem is if Twitter didn't exist, someone would come up with some version of it. At some point, some innovator is going to come in with some other thing that's better than Twitter. I don't know, like some subcutaneous chip that goes in your neck that just gives you political hot takes directly into your bloodstream. I don't know what it is, but someone's going to come up with it. But the main problem with Twitter, and look at this, this starts with Trump himself, but I shouldn't say it starts with Trump. Trump is a symptom of it because it was a problem before Trump, is that the Acela corridor, elite media, all these kind of people, they hang out on it all day long. There are journalists on the left and the right who really think reporting is just sort of vegging out like a friggin', methadone study monkey on Twitter, and you find 3 tweets that make a trend and like, oh, I've got a story now. It's all garbage. Real America is not Twitter and all that kind of stuff. I'm just sort of torn because, first of all, I think the world does need my tweets about my dogs, but also I'm in this business and I got to see what other people are saying. And then I also make the mistake of joining in. But I don't know. It's going to be tough to get rid of it. I don't know what the path is to liberate us from this bondage.
So staying on the same theme of tech type stuff, would charging social media like Facebook and Google for republishing news articles regenerate local newspapers and media in a positive direction? This is a question from Reader.
I'm open to the idea. I know that Facebook, which I'm the first to concede is a very mixed bag for the society. They've realized to a certain extent how much damage they have done to local media, and they're doing some stuff trying to buttress it in some ways. But I just don't know. I mean, I don't know the mechanics of it. What's funny is, in a not necessarily a ha-ha sense, the online entity that has I don't want to say the most blame, but maybe the most blame. Certainly, they were. How many knives stabbed Caesar? Theirs was the first knife. Was Craigslist. Craigslist destroyed the number one source of revenue for local newspapers, which was classified ads.
Yep.
And the newspaper industry got caught flat-footed, didn't see the threat that was coming. I'm not sure what they could have done, but they could have done something. And once classified ads went by the wayside, the demise of the newspaper industry was a foregone conclusion. How you fix that part of the business model, I just don't know. Yeah.
No, it's certainly an interesting time. My dad worked in local news, and so I'm very familiar with that situation. But I'm partial to the theory that it was giving articles away for free on the internet may have been
that was a problem. At first, that's what they did. They thought, you build it, they will come kind of thing. And now everybody's going the other direction, right? I mean, that's one of the things. I didn't get into the whole pitch about the Dispatch, but one of the models that we have is we don't have ads. We think one of the things that is destroying a lot of places is the corruption of this idea that you need quantity of eyeballs rather than quality of eyeballs. And so you make money if you get 10 million eyeballs, and you lose money if you get 1,000 eyeballs. And I understand that's how markets kind of work. But the problem is the only way you get 10 million eyeballs is by putting something absolutely outrageous and crazy out there that, like flies to dog crap, everyone comes to. We think it's sort of corrupting and all of that. And that's why we're sort of one of the big leaders in the newsletter model and the subscription model, or we don't call it membership model. Because, Steve thinks it's corrupting on the editorial side. I tend to agree. But my primary concern is I think it ruins the reading experience, the user experience. Where's that video coming from? Where's that sound coming? How do I turn this off? That kind of thing. That's what you get when you have a clickbait model. And I think it ruins the experience.
Right. So this is a question from Noah Garfinkel, who is a Collegiate Network intern at the Washington Free Beacon this summer. How do we focus on being fair as journalists and not pandering to a specific party? Is it just about representing views we disagree with well, or does it include something else?
Well, I mean, it kind of depends what you're going to do. I mean, I'm still generally of the school that, and I'm sorry I keep playing with my hair, but I have not, since the pandemic started, I have not had a haircut in some of the I think most of the journalistic ethics stuff is bunk. It's guild stuff that, that keeps certain people employed. But I think ethics, forget journalistic ethics, ethics are pretty good, in morality are a pretty good guide. The first thing I would tell young writers and this is not about the Free Beacon, this is just a general point. Don't lie. Do not say things that you do not believe to be true, whether you're an opinion person or a reporter. I cannot tell you, one of the reasons why I started the Dispatch was my profound bowel-stewing disgust for the number of people I know on the right, who some of whom are still friends, some of whom used to be friends, who say one thing when the camera is on and another thing when the camera is off, or the microphone is on and the microphone is off, or when they're writing for public use or when they're writing an email. Don't lie. Alexander Solzhenitsyn has this line, let the lie come in the world, let the lie win, but not through me. It's fine to be wrong. It's fine to only talk about the stuff that you want to talk about. You're not under any obligation to sort of make other people's arguments for them if you don't want to. But be honest. And part of the racket that big chunk of the right has become is that a lot of people are saying stuff that their audience or their customers want to hear, not that they actually believe. And that's part of the problem with the Republican Party today, too. Beyond that, try to be fair, right? I mean, and try to recognize that, William Rusher at National Review, a longtime publisher at National Review, he always used to say to the young whippersnappers and the ISI interns, politicians will always disappoint you. And he wasn't saying that to say the politicians were necessarily bad people, though he obviously thought some politicians were very bad people. He said it because the incentive structure for politicians is different for that of ideologically, principally motivated young people who are weird enough to want to be interns for ISI or at National Review or at the Free Beacon. And you shouldn't confuse your responsibilities for what the politicians' responsibilities are.
Okay, so here's a good question. I'm kind of consolidating it from a few people here, but so what should kind of, students interested in journalism that want to work in the field kind of do during college to kind of get themselves ready for that career?
Okay, so my standard answer on this is do not major in journalism. My dad was an editor for 40 years. He was in the newspaper business and the syndication business. He hated journalism schools. Steve Hayes, who went to Columbia Journalism School, basically agrees with my entire argument here. He has just some interesting flavor to add to it. But the Columbia Journalism School, which has many fine people at it, I've spoken there and blah, 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 blah. It's a guild. And what you end up having is the professors, the administrators, and the graduates all have a vested interest in perpetuating the prestige of the guild. So they tend to hire people from the guild because they want that to be valuable, and it's public choice 101 stuff. Doesn't mean everyone who comes out of there is bad. It's just kind of BS. But particularly in undergrad, my dad always used to say, look, I'm going to send a reporter to Russia. Do I want someone who majored in Russian or European history or economics even, who can write well? Or do I want someone who majored in a major that I could teach you in 3 days? Like, here's what a nut graph is. Here's what a topic sentence is. Here's what you got to do to get all that kind of stuff. And it'd be one thing if journalism majors or journalism schools taught you about source cultivation, all that kind of stuff. They don't do a lot of that. Instead, it's all of this woke nonsense. It's like education schools don't teach you how to teach. They teach you the theory about education, which makes me want to cut myself. So, the thing you want to do is become an expert in something. Find something you love. Find something you're interested in and learn how to be a good writer at it. And then go become a reporter at it. You will be a more valuable reporter, a more successful reporter if you know something. Forget knowing something. If you just know what you don't know about something and you're curious and you want to go out in the world and discover something interesting about something you're really interested in already, that will make you a good reporter. The stuff that journalism programs teach about, the mechanics of journalism, you can learn from some YouTube videos and a couple books, or from a good mentor at a good journalistic institution.
So I think we'll get two more questions in here. This is a really good one. For someone who is just starting to learn about conservatism, what do you recommend for them to read or to do?
Putting my books aside, if you're it depends on what kind of conservative you are and what your interest is. But if you're into the philosophical stuff, I have my disagreements with George Nash's conservative intellectual movement since 1945, but it's like one of my favorite books ever. And it is just an awesome introduction to this great chain of being of conservative intellectuals. I think you should read Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions. I think you should read the ISI edition of What is Conservatism? But I also just think you should read history. I can come up with some history books for you to read. You should read about the first third of The Closing of the American Mind. The rest of it, don't worry about. I can come up with a bunch of these kinds of things. It would be interesting. I mean, it depends on what your interest level is. But if you have a good library near you, going back and just reading back issues of National Review will be really instructive, both on the good parts and the bad parts. National Review made a lot of mistakes in the 1960s, and it's good to know about those too, in terms of keeping your side honest. But reading in general, I think, is helpful if you want to be a conservative. Read Paul Johnson's Modern Times, Great History of the 20th Century, and I'll spend the rest of the night thinking of other things I should have said.
Okay, so last question here, and hopefully this can be on a optimistic note. So this is from Daniel Shore. Do you believe that today's younger generations will become more conservative as they get older? If not, what pragmatic steps can conservative institutions take to alter the increasingly left-wing trajectory of young voters?
Tough question, particularly with your insinuation that I should be optimistic. I think, let me put it this way. I think younger people, the average young person is more conservative than the spokespeople of young people claim. I think that at the same time, you shouldn't care about it that much. I generally don't like generational stereotyping. I don't believe that the greatest generation was the greatest generation. Or at the very least, I don't believe that if you were in a drunk tank, in Newark, New Jersey on D-Day, you should get any credit for the people who stormed Normandy Beach. There's a weird transitive property that comes with generational stereotyping that I reject. Conservatism is about the individual to a large extent, and the family and these institutions and that kind of thing. And you don't get credit for what other people did, and you don't get blamed for what other people did. So you should also just keep in mind, and this is, I mean, I'm deliberately not answering the question as asked because I don't have a great answer for it, but don't despair. Despair is a sin, at least in Catholicism. I'm not Catholic, but I married one. There's a tendency, particularly among intellectual types, to make straight line projections into the future about where we are. And those are always wrong, always wrong. And, Edmund Burke said the example is the school of mankind, and he will learn it no other. And what he meant by that is sometimes you just have to show people, you can't just tell people. So even if the woke mobs got all the power, I guarantee you they'd screw it up. And we would learn from that. And that would be a cautionary tale. And this idea that if we let the other side have even a moment of power, everything is over, is a complete rejection of what America is actually about. You know, I mean, it's like when people said in 2016, and look, I despise Hillary Clinton, never written a positive sentence about her. But when people said in 2016 that we're one election away from the end of America, it's Flight 93 and all that kind of stuff. If we're one election away from the end of America, America is already over. Because the whole point of this country is that politics shouldn't matter that much. And one of the great things about conservatism is it, sort of borrowing from T.S. Eliot, is that we understand that there's no such thing as a truly lost cause, because there's no such thing as a truly won cause. You just keep fighting it out. And one of the great things about being conservative is you get to be a happy warrior, because you're on the side of freedom and liberty. You're on the side of the greatest anti-poverty program that humanity has ever come up with. And frankly, if you read my most recent book, the only anti-poverty program that humanity has ever come up with. And we're always going to be outnumbered by people who think the group is more important than the individual, that the state should just impose the best things, that you know, politics shouldn't be messy and we should just leave it up to experts. We're always going to be outnumbered by those people because most people don't think about politics seriously. But that's okay, because we're on the right side. We're happy warriors. You know, we're like Henry V with his "We Happy Few." And what better place to stand than to be among those people who are on the side of the greatest alleviation of poverty in all of human history, the only alleviation of poverty in human history, the side of human liberty, the side of human flourishing, and the proper understanding of what it takes to be a fulfilled human being. That's where we stand. And that's a great thing to be outnumbered about. And, you know, in the meantime, live your life. You know, the fight for liberty begins in your own backyard. The most important things in life aren't about politics, about your family, your friends, your faith, your community. If everyone dealt with that stuff responsibly, we would have no big national political problems. And that's where you should start your orientation. And if you can do that through ISI, that would be great too. Anyway, thank you.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, Jonah. And thanks to everyone who has hung in there for the full just over an hour. Hop on to join.isi.org to learn more about ISI, to sign up to be a member. We thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Keep up alive.